Hello, I'm Marisol Wong-Villacres, researcher at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Thank you so much for clicking on this video. It is exciting to be able to share work with the CHI community. I'd like to start this presentation by walking you through the motivation for this research, and that has been our 4-year ethnographic exploration on how technologies can support the educational system in catering to the needs of Hispanic immigrant parents, specifically in the city of Atlanta, United States. Historically, across the United States, it has been extremely difficult for Hispanic immigrant parents to work together with schools. Parents' many differences from the norm, like language, cultural practices, and even jobs, often prevent them from keeping up with school-related information. Also, the educational system tends to misread parents' limitations as a lack of care from their part. In our work, across 16 locations, and with over 300 parents, teachers, and decision makers, we've seen firsthand how the introduction of new technologies into the educational system only widens the gap. These interventions never consider these parents' realities and thus end up imposing practices that parents often reject, like keeping up with different messages and installing different apps. From its beginning, the goal of our work has been precisely to change all of this, and for that, we made the commitment of embracing an assets-based design process. In spite of our work in community development, HCI scholars have increasingly proposed assets-based as a desirable approach when designing for vulnerable groups. In essence, assets-based recognizes how vulnerable groups are rich in knowledge, skills, social capital, and other assets, and proposes to work with these groups in designing technologies that use such assets to produce sustained change. After 3 years relying on this assets-based perspective to guide our fieldwork, we decided we were ready to take the next step and engage in designing with parents. Over a month, we conducted several participatory workshops with 35 parents in 3 of our previous locations. We first worked with parents in a series of activities that elicited their reflection on the assets they use to face everyday challenges. And then we moved to working with parents in imagining technologies that will leverage their assets for changing the school system. Now, we needed to empower and compel parents to do this. And so for that, we presented them with a parenting-related narrative that asked parents to propose design solutions for helping characters from El Chavo del Ocho, a beloved Mexican TV show that is also extremely popular across Latin America. Parents' design work entail assigning magical attributes to everyday objects like a map, head antennas, and a magnifying glass. 13 design concepts emerged from this activity. I won't touch much on this methodology, but I'd like to invite you to read more about it in our paper. The data we collected were indeed very rich and promising. However, when we tried to analyze them for devising realistic interventions, we realized this was not going to be a seamless process. Basically, we faced the problem that previous HCI work in assets-based design has already hinted. Assets are not static traits. They're actually attributes that become assets given a particular situation. And thus, what is an asset in one context can be a constraint in another. For example, our participants saw their perseverance as an asset, motivating them to pursue goals. However, their perseverance often led them to overfocus, and then it blinded them from other opportunities. Another problem we faced was that parents' assets-based designs were not seamlessly related to educational goals. They have more to do with ensuring family togetherness and teaching value-based lessons to children. This suggested an important question for anyone doing assets-based design, and that is, what will be an appropriate methodology for unpacking how participants' situated use of assets can effectively inform technology-based interventions. To devise this methodology, we first looked for an analytical lens that could help us unpack people's actions as well as their limitations to act. We looked at approaches within and outside HCI, like for instance activity theory and Bourdieu's theory of capital, amongst others. None were appreciative of assets and limitations as a whole package. Activity theory, for example, tends to downplay structural limitations, and the theory of capital dismisses non-traditional forms of capital. So we decided to turn to sociology and explore Swidler's theory of culture in action, which is not a lens that HCI has used much before. We were initially drawn to it because it proposes that people are resourceful problem solvers, while also recognizing that the ways in which people solve problems are often shaped by structural limitations. In essence, this theory describes the way people act as highly shaped by the many capacities that they've acquired as they interact with culture at large. Essentially, it proposes that each one of us has a cultural toolkit, we can draw from for assembling strategies of action that help us face everyday problems without having to think about them too much. As these heuristics become more prevalent in our lives, they actually start defining the goals that we pursue when we face a problem. So for example, if we face the problem of choosing teammates and we're really, really good at reading signs of loyalty, we'll most likely choose teammates who seem very loyal to us. We found these theories focused on capacities much promising for our goal. First, it can provide rich insights into why different people use different cultural resources to solve problems. And then it can also offer a richer understanding of what assets are. They no longer need to be these productive traits that society values. They can actually be all the capacities that people use for solving problems. So once we decided to use culture in action as a lens, the problem still remained. How can we actually use this theory to inform a methodology for analyzing assets-based data? This theory is telling us the strategy of action is a start point for understanding how and why action takes place. It basically tells us that strategies can tell us the real goal behind people's actions. This is important for our analysis. If we can identify people's goals, we will be able to envision goals for design. So to address this issue, we identified parents' different strategies from our data. And then per strategy, we identified the problem that the strategy was trying to solve. Having the problem and the strategy, we were now able to identify participants' capacities and limitations to act. And only then, with all that information, we were able to conclude the underlying goal. So, for example, in our data, we saw parents pursuing self-learning as a very common strategy of action, but the underlying goal of choosing that strategy over others was not really clear. So what we did is that we analyzed all the times parents engaged in self-learning, and we found that one of the problems they were trying to solve was to address their social discomfort of being in a foreign country. And further analyzing this problem, we saw that the capacities they use to engage in this strategy were control of their own space, a desire to self-improve, and an ability to find sites for learning. However, their use of these capacities was often limited by their fear to fail and be judged. From this, it was now easier to realize that parents' underlying goal is to attain self-empowerment in ways that are safe to them. That is, in ways that minimize the risk for them to face failure or social embarrassment. Now, in terms of design, this is already telling us plenty. For example, when designing to support parents' learning, we cannot force social components, for that will probably scare them off. Now, I'd like to show you how we use this methodology to envision possible interventions in the educational system. For this, I'll center the analysis on the strategy of parenting via consejos. This word translates directly into advice, but in the context of parenting, we saw it entails much more than that. So, for instance, we have the case of Clara. She's a mother of 3. And her story illustrates really well how consejos work. When some kids at school bullied Clara's daughters, telling them that Clara was fat, Clara used consejos to change her children's view of bullying. She sat down with them and had a long conversation explaining how their family was in a better socioeconomic and probably emotional position than the bullies. Thus, whatever the bullies said did not matter much after all. As this example shows, consejos are a strategy that addresses the problem of changing children's behavior through value-based elements. In Clara's case, she used the notion of family togetherness and even classism to emphasize differences across her family and the bullies. Such mastery in using values when crafting consejos suggests that the usual goal of this strategy is to motivate value-based growth, which for Clara meant to help her daughters feel proud of who they are. Our data show us that parents use this strategy a lot when they're trying to impact their children's education as well. However, in these cases, using only value-based discourses is not necessarily always enough. Here we have the case of Regina and Roberto to provide an example of this. Both Regina and Roberto tackled the problem of changing their children's academic behavior by fostering a value-based development. Regina used fear and guilt for motivating her child to attend college, and Roberto used examples of effort to convince his daughters of studying math. However, Roberto's ability of mixing school-related examples with a value-based discourse might give him a higher chance of attaining this goal. Many of our participants, including Regina, believe that that type of school talk is key to impact children's education. However, engaging in such school talk is really hard for most parents. Regina, for example, did not have a good experience with school growing up. Her parents frequently scolded her for not being smart enough and finally took her out of school to work in the fields. Regina felt that her life experiences had made her rather an expert on discourses around perseverance and hard work, and that's what she used on an everyday basis to self-motivate. With this knowledge of what parents do and what they really want to do, the next step in our analysis was to understand the cases of Regina and Roberto. Was to understand the role that technology can have in supporting parents as they learn more school talk. Further, we need to know if and how we could use parents' capacity of consejos to design such technology. We thus turn to analyze parents' designs. As I mentioned before, these were narratives on how certain objects could acquire magical powers to solve the parenting problems of beloved TV characters. In this case, the designs themselves represented strategies of action. So to analyze these designs, we first grouped them based on the problems they were trying to solve. For example, we grouped together all designs that address the problem of changing people's behavior. And from there, per artifact, we perform a similar analysis to the one I mentioned before. And finally, we compared our new analysis with the ones we already had. Any differences in capacities, limitations, or goals could then shed light on new design directions. Let me show you how this works. For instance, our analysis revealed the concept of pluma aspiracional, or aspirational pen, as one that addresses a similar problem than consejos, that is changing someone's behavior. In the case of this design, however, it referred to changing other parents' behavior. The concept proposes a magical pen and notepad that a parent could use to track down their everyday activities, like how many hours they work per week. The notepad will then magically react, showing the pros and cons of such activities for supporting children's academic attainment. So for instance, if a parent is writing down that they work over 40 hours per week, the notepad will tell them that working so many hours will deter their child's chances to go to college. Just like parents did, this concept is trying to deal with the academic problem through values, in this case using guilt, fear, and aspirations. However, we can see it uses other interesting capacities. For example, it brings elements of school talk and mixes them with this value-based discourse to help parents reflect on how to best support their children. It also harnesses the impersonal nature of a notepad as a visible medium for giving such blunt, school-related consejos to parents. It becomes clear then that technology that uses consejos for teaching school talk to parents will do better if they ensure that these consejos come in the form of non-human actors. For example, parents might be willing to learn school talk from smart technologies that use a value-based speech. Parents might also be willing to learn school talk from other parents, as long as these learning lessons come in the form of impersonal media, such as videos or audios of other parents outside their social network. Now, having demonstrated how we use this culture in action lens to support design, I now would like to discuss 3 ways in which we think this theoretical lens can further impact assets-based work in HCI. First, this lens emphasis on strategies of action and problem solving facilitates a holistic understanding of assets. Rather than assuming assets as positive traits only, this view forces us to ask way more questions about why participants act in certain ways and why they use capacities versus others. Second, by revealing capacities as imperfect elements that are clashing with other capacities and limitations, a culture in action view augments possible design directions. For example, if a capacity is not working, we will still need to unpack it to see why it doesn't work and derive other design lessons from it. And finally, when using participatory design for collecting data on capacities, we suggest to consider 3 aspects. First, it is important to ensure that participants are exposed to a diversity of experiences for discussing their assets from different perspectives. It is also important to provide participants with time to reflect on what they are learning about themselves. And finally, it is important to lower technological ambitions and rather focus on facilitating culturally familiar and compelling spaces for creation. And with that, I end my presentation. Thank you again for watching. We'd love to learn your thoughts on this work, either over email or Twitter.